I know there are people following me from all over the world in all different kinds of walks of life. And sometimes I'll get comments from people saying, writing this from Ukraine, my town was just bombed. People with ties to Gaza, people in the US who are really struggling. And unfortunately, I don't have anything to say to make it all better, to take away your suffering. But I have been getting some requests lately to talk about coping during really turbulent times. And I do have a few thoughts on the topic from a emotional mindset aspect. But these are realizations and pieces of advice that have helped me reframe catastrophe in my own personal head. So in this video, I'm going to share some advice for how to survive and even thrive in really bad times. And also, before I get into it, just a reminder that my second novel, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, is set to publish in this June 2025. So make sure you're subscribed for my email newsletter so that you can be notified as soon as it's out. You can find that at drannayuden.com. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is a concept that has honestly revolutionized my life. And every time I struggle, whether with my own mental health or with external circumstances, this really helps me cope. And that is understanding that everything in this universe is a pendulum swing. History, for instance, throughout every nation, tends to fluctuate between people on the right in power, people on the left in power, then people on the right in power, then people on the left in power, or even just the contrast between tension and peace. There are periods where tensions are rising, usually it blows over and then go back to peace, and then it happens all over again, this pendulum swing. This happens in psychology too. For example, rarely will someone idealize someone without then swinging into his opposite of devaluation. The pendulum swings. It happens with biology. It happens with the environment. There's summer, pendulum swings to winter, then back to summer, then back to winter. You get the picture. And in our personal lives too. Sometimes things are going really well. Other times they devolve. Then they're back to going really well. And then they go to shit again. Unfortunately, we can't have a net positive all the time because that's simply not how the laws of the universe work. And honestly, even if it were always a net positive, it wouldn't feel that way because we always need a point of comparison. So we would still start to see some things as negative even then. And another concept that goes along with this is that you cannot separate the positive from the negative. Every positive has its shadow. Like, you got promoted? Great, that's a positive. Except now you have less time to spend with your family. Similarly, every negative has a positive shadow. Oh, you got fired. I think that would fall as a negative. But on the other hand, it has this positive shadow of it forced you to find a better job. And you'll find that the negative always precipitates the beginning of the positive. When the moon is full, for instance, is that the peak of the moon cycle, or is it the beginning of the shedding of the cycle? Or when you learn a very painful but much needed lesson, does it signal the end of an era, or is it the beginning of a more positive era? It kind of depends how you look at it. The positive and the negative are inextricable. They're kind of like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. We think of these things as distinct and separate and even opposites, but really they're not. They're two sides of the same coin. They can't be separated. So when I find my life going to shit, I try not to take the pendulum swing too personally. And that's not to say that it's not still extremely painful, but it just doesn't feel personal because I acknowledge this isn't happening to me because the universe hates me. This is happening because this is how the universe works. But like I said, that doesn't take away the pain. And what you have to do even after accepting that about the universe is you have to feel your grief about what's happened. Because understanding the concept I just explained, it's not about numbing yourself. You should still feel your grief fully. Except it should be without the resistance and without the defenses that keep you from fully processing it. For example, some of you might already be angry over what I just said. Like, how can she just say, don't take it personally? This is personal. Underneath that anger, I imagine there's a much deeper, more painful feeling of grief because anger often masks grief. And acceptance is what happens when you're no longer resisting your grief with things like anger and defense mechanisms like repression. When you simply allow yourself to weep for all the pain that you've endured. And you can do this work of processing through your grief by crying, by journaling, by talking it out with loved ones, by going to therapy. Creating art is a really big one for me. For instance, when I have a worry or painful experience, I alchemize it into a work of fiction, and it helps me process through it. Afterwards, I feel like, okay, I'm kind of done with this. Not that it's never going to be painful for me again, but I just feel like been there, done that. So art is always a really good way to process through your grief. Now, this next piece of advice is from my grandma, who is the strongest person I know. She is such a wise lady, and she's had a really tough life. I actually talk more about all the different things she's experienced in life on my channel, Book and Hearth. I'll pop that video up here if you want to watch it. But she's always telling me, trebuie să te strecori, which is kind of hard to translate directly, but it roughly translates to how can you slip around something, like in a sieve. You know, when you're like washing vegetables in a sieve, the water passes through it and then the vegetables stay in it. You have to be like the water passing through the sieve. And I think about this all the time. When I see the world going up in flames, I always ask myself, how am I going to pass around this? How are me and my loved ones going to avoid catastrophe? What is the safest, best place for me to be right now? Whether it means career-wise, whether it means geographically, whatever it means. And if there's an action I can take, I take it. For example, a year ago when I announced to people that I'm not going to get licensed as a psychologist, I don't want to be a therapist anymore, and I'm moving to Europe to be an author, I didn't get a super positive reaction from everyone in my life. Some people were angry, some people were worried. The people that trusted in me were honestly the most okay with it, and they were like, yeah, I think you're making the right decision for yourself, because they knew that I could make good decisions for myself. But other people who had more of an insecure worldview, where like they feel like they can't trust the world, they didn't react too well. And the thing is, now I have friends and family in the US who rely on, for instance, a federal institution and are now feeling the impacts of new policies, losing their jobs, no longer having funding for their doctorate programs, no longer having funding for their work research, being invited to quit their jobs. Private pay therapist referrals are still down by 75% because of things like BetterHelp. And of course, people just can't afford healthcare out of pocket right now. Because back then I asked myself, how can I pass around these issues? I now hear from people, wow, Anna, you picked the best time to leave, and you made such a good decision to not rely on an institution for your income. That question is always in my mind. How can I slip around this? How can I be where it's best for me to be at this point in time? What action do I need to take? And unfortunately, you can't save everyone. And although we should try to help other people as much as possible, when the world is crumbling around you, you gotta do whatever you need to do to keep yourself and your loved ones safe. Slip through like water in a sieve. Be the water, not whatever gets trapped in the sieve. Now, something that made me really mad recently that I found out was Sebastian Stan is a Romanian-American actor. He moved to the US when he was like 8 years old, I think. And I heard that a bunch of people were judging him for being able to flee the communist dictatorship in Romania when he did. And they were saying like, oh, his mom must have connections because no one was able to flee at that time. And I'm like, dude, you're judging someone for using all the tools at their disposal to get their family to safety? That's messed up. I think that's admirable. I think you should use all the tools at your disposal to keep your loved ones safe. But you know how it is. Misery loves company. But then you can even take it one step further and beyond just passing around difficult circumstances. How can I take advantage of the situation? What hidden opportunities are there that could make me end up even better at the end of this? Because remember, the pendulum swing to catastrophe is inextricable from the way it's about to bounce back to the other side. It's the same momentum, pushing it from one side to the other. And every dark experience has a light underbelly. Try to find the yang within the yin. Try to think about, okay, this is a really shitty circumstance. If I were, mastermind, supervillain, whatever, an ethical supervillain, I might add, how could I benefit from this? For example, I know a lot of people were really freaked out over the TikTok ban. I was not worried about it whatsoever. And the reason for that was, from my perspective, I have been trying to use TikTok to market my book for over a year at this point. And I understand that where there is a gap in the market, someone's going to fill that gap. There's going to be a new app that pops up. And when that happens, the market's really undersaturated, and that is the best time to pop off. So from my perspective, it was kind of like, well, yeah, TikTok's going to go down. Small business owners like myself are going to suffer because of it. But something better will come around, and that's when I can come in at the opportune time. Or, people who were buying cheap homes during the house market crash. They were making the most of a really bad situation. Of course, they had the resources to do that. Most people couldn't do that. But there might be, even in your situation, a way that you could benefit from it. If you sort of switch from the mindset of I'm a victim of circumstance to actually I'm a little bit of a supervillain, let me use this to my advantage. And this, I think, is the key that differentiates just surviving from thriving. It's not just let me survive this difficult circumstance, it's let me actually come out of it even better. And again, I think a really key point here is you have to do it ethically. Like maybe don't pull a Coco Chanel and befriend the Nazis to solve your business woes. That is not going to turn out great for you in the end. Going along with this, decide that you are going to be one of the survivors. Obviously, there are tons of things outside of our control. We are not omnipotent. Sometimes we are just in the wrong place, wrong time. People are victims of circumstance all the time, and it's not that they had the wrong mindset, it just happens. But when a crisis occurs, in some circumstances, setting the intention that you are going to survive no matter what can actually increase your chances of surviving. For example, Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, spoke in his book Man's Search for Meaning about how when one of his peers gave up hope, gave up the will to survive, that often predicted their death. We have to get really in touch with our will to survive. You have to decide right here and now that you will be one of the people that comes out on the other side of this. How does this work? The brain doesn't distinguish between real and imagined, so if you can visualize surviving in your mind before it happens, you're kind of priming yourself to do it. Like who's more likely to survive in a plane crash? The person who made a mental map of the plane before taking off, who rehearsed surviving in their mind. To that person, it's kind of like they're doing it the second time around if that situation comes up. Another reason why it works is that having the will to live is a state of high energy, and that can initiate life-saving action, whereas the person who's in a low energy state is not going to be as reactive, is not going to get with the punches as quickly. And also, sometimes it's just about holding on a little bit longer because salvation and relief is just around the corner. So if you make that decision, I will be one of the ones who survives, you just might outlive people. Something else that's really important is to just invest in your immediate circle. Focus on everyday connections with your loved ones. When the world is going to shit around you, all that really matters really at the end of the day is what is happening in your actual life. Putting aside what's happening out there, like during the pandemic, for instance, you couldn't go anywhere. You were stuck at home. What happened out there wasn't relevant. What happened inside the home? That's what was relevant. My husband and I, for instance, we used to hear our neighbors screaming at the top of their lungs at each other. Very different from how we kind of liked having that alone time during the pandemic. During time of catastrophe, that's arguably the most important time to make sure that you're really showing up as your best self for your family, for your friends, leaning on each other, being each other's sources of strength, and try to make sure that you're interacting in real life with people as much as possible. Because once you do that, what happens outside of that will start to feel just a lot less significant. For instance, I'm already foreseeing that once my baby is born, it's going to completely change my priorities. It's not going to matter so much what some rando said to me on YouTube or what someone said to me at the supermarket or yada, yada, yada. Because my priority is how do I make this the healthiest, best, happiest, coziest family life. I can't afford to get upset over stupid shit because then it affects my child. Try to always bring it back to that. Try to always bring it back to who are the people that I most value in my life and how do I invest on them during this difficult time. And then lastly, I think it can be helpful, instead of thinking, why me, to think about how at 80 years old, it's going to be a little bit cool to be able to tell people that you lived through such a historic time. I was talking with my friend of mine about how, everything going on in the US has been impacting her. And she said something like, I just feel really robbed of my youth. I went through the pandemic and now this is happening and I just feel like I never got to enjoy being a young person in my 20s. And again, that's one of those situations where I can't take away her pain. The grief is there, it must be processed. But it makes me think about how during the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, I was going to the supermarket, there was a line around the corner, everyone was terrified, the buildings were all boarded up because of protests, it felt very apocalyptic. And I remember even back then, even though it was extremely scary and destabilizing, thinking to myself, one day my grandkids are probably going to be like, Grandma, I can't believe you went through that. That's crazy. Kind of like how I approach my grandma with some of the things she's experienced. there's a certain wisdom and resilience that you get from that is kind of cool. And I think about how, like, after so many waves of the pandemic surging, at some point I thought, okay, well, this is forever now. Like, life is never going to go back to normal. Everyone in, like, fiction and movies is always going to be depicted wearing masks. Like, this is a before and after moment of, like, before COVID, after COVID. And in some ways, I think, we do obviously have to live with COVID now forever. But now looking back, I'm like, what an insane time that was, that's where my head was at. That I actually thought that was it. Like, that really speaks to what an insane thing we went through at that time. Sometimes going through really difficult things gives you a very unique type of wisdom, is what I'm saying. I hope that this was helpful to the extent that it can be. I'm sorry that I can't take away your pain that so many of you are feeling, but I do think we're living through some very strange times. And I know probably everyone thinks that about the times they're living through, but I don't know. I feel this tension rising. I've been feeling it for years at this point, and it just feels like at some point it's about to blow its fuse. And we're all more or less in this together. I hope you have a nice rest of your week, and I'll see you soon.